Chapter 1. The Woman Who Counted Stitches. Clara Henshaw first noticed the counting before she understood anything else. Not the room, though it was undeniably particular, with its low velvet chairs and shelves of yarn arranged in exact chromatic progression, like a painter too orderly for instinct. Not the women, though each seemed to carry herself with the quiet assurance of someone accustomed to being listened to, and certainly not the talk, which moved gently and without urgency, touching on trivialities with surprising care. It was the counting. Mrs. Eleanor Wycliffe sat near the window, her needles moving with a soft, rhythmic click that was neither hurried nor idle. Her lips moved faintly, not speaking, not murmuring to anyone, but forming numbers. Clara watched, not meaning to stare, and realised after a moment that Mrs. Wycliffe was counting every stitch under her breath, as though each one required acknowledgement before being allowed to exist. It struck Clara as oddly intimate. "I do hope you'll forgive us," said Mrs. Dalrymple from the adjacent chair, adjusting her shawl with a deliberate slowness. "We have our little habits here. Eleanor finds that counting steadies the hand, though I've always thought it steadies something else entirely." Mrs. Wycliffe did not look up. "Precision prevents regret," she said gently. "One learns that, given enough time." The remark seemed harmless, yet it lingered. Clara, who had only joined the parlour that week, found herself nodding as though she understood. In truth, she did not. She had come because her aunt insisted it would be good for her, though Clara suspected it was less about knitting and more about observation. Her aunt had always believed that rooms full of women revealed more truth than any courtroom. Miss Jane Marple, seated opposite Clara, gave a small, approving hum. "I once knew a woman in St. Mary Mead," she said, her tone mild and almost apologetic, "who kept accounts of everything. Not money, mind you, but favours, who had called upon her, who had neglected to write, who had borrowed and not returned. She wrote it all down in a little red book. We all thought it most unnecessary, but one did notice that she never forgot anything, and that, I think, made others rather uneasy." Mrs. Dalrymple gave a soft laugh. "How very exhausting that must have been." "Yes," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "for everyone." Mrs. Wycliffe's needles paused, only for a moment, but Clara saw it. Then the counting resumed. The disturbance occurred later that afternoon, though it was described afterward in such varying ways that Clara found it difficult to be certain of the truth. Mrs. Pembroke claimed her scarf had unravelled in her lap without her touching it. Miss Grant insisted she had placed her needles neatly on the table only to find them moved, precisely aligned, but not where she had left them. And Mrs. Dalrymple, who spoke with careful emphasis, remarked that the door to the dyeing shed had opened of its own accord, despite the fact that no one possessed a key. "It is not the first time," she added, lowering her voice in a manner that suggested she very much wished to be overheard. "There have been occurrences." Clara glanced toward Mrs. Wycliffe, expecting irritation, perhaps dismissal. Instead, she found something else. A stillness. Mrs. Wycliffe did not protest. She did not correct or clarify. She continued knitting, counting softly, as though the conversation belonged to another room entirely. Miss Marple's eyes, however, had sharpened. "It is always interesting," she said, "how objects move when one is not looking at them. In St. Mary Mead there was a gentleman, Colonel Hargreaves, who insisted that his papers were constantly being rearranged by unseen hands. It caused him a great deal of distress, though it turned out, of course, that he had simply developed the habit of putting them away without remembering it, a very human difficulty, forgetting what one has done oneself." Mrs. Pembroke leaned forward. "But surely you are not suggesting—" "Oh no," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I never suggest anything. And I only find it curious how often the simplest explanation is overlooked in favour of the most imaginative." Her gaze moved briefly to Mrs. Wycliffe, then away again. That evening Clara found herself lingering in the narrow hallway that led to the back of the house. She had meant to retrieve her gloves, nothing more, but the house possessed a way of encouraging hesitation, of making one pause where one had not intended to stop. The door to the courtyard stood slightly ajar. Beyond it the dyeing shed loomed in quiet neglect, its cracked copper vat catching what little light remained. Clara could smell something faintly metallic, mingled with the older scent of damp wool and long-abandoned work. She stepped closer, and saw quite clearly that the door had been recently opened, not by accident, not by age or neglect, but with care. The latch had been lifted cleanly, the hinges moved without resistance. Someone had been there. Behind her the floorboard creaked. Clara turned. Mrs. Wycliffe stood in the doorway, her knitting absent for the first time that day. "I do prefer," she said softly, "that the rear of the house remains undisturbed. It serves no purpose now, and it has a way of encouraging unnecessary speculation." Clara flushed slightly. "I only thought—" "Yes," said Mrs. Wycliffe. "People often do." There was no anger in her voice, only something quieter, and far more final. Later, as they prepared to leave, Miss Marple adjusted her gloves with delicate care. "It is a charming place," she said, almost to herself, "though one does feel that it has been arranged rather too carefully, and when things are arranged with such precision, one cannot help wondering what is being kept in place, and what might happen if it were allowed to shift." Clara hesitated. "Do you think something is wrong?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, something is always wrong. The question is whether anyone is ready to notice it." She paused, then added almost idly, "and whether the person who notices it understands what they are seeing." Clara thought of the counting, of the stillness, of the door that had opened too easily, and for the first time she felt that she had stepped into something, not dangerous, not yet, but already in motion, something that had begun long before her arrival, and would not stop simply because she had noticed it. See Chapter 2. What the Yarn? Remembered. Clara returned the following afternoon with the uneasy determination of someone who suspects she has already become involved in something she does not yet understand. It was not curiosity alone, though that played its part, but a quieter compulsion, the kind that settles behind ordinary thought and refuses to be dismissed. She told herself, sensibly, that knitting parlours did not harbour mysteries, that misplaced needles and loose threads were hardly cause for concern. Yet as she approached the narrow Georgian townhouse, she found herself slowing slightly, as though the building required a different pace of entry. Inside, the air carried a faint sweetness. Lavender, perhaps, but beneath it lingered something else, something older, not unpleasant, simply persistent, the scent of wool that had absorbed years of hands and habits. Mrs. Dalrymple greeted her with a smile that suggested both warmth and evaluation. "You have come back," she said, as though this confirmed something she had expected. "One always wonders after the first visit whether a person will return. It tells one a great deal." Clara removed her gloves. "I should think most people do return. It is a pleasant place." "Yes," Mrs. Dalrymple replied, settling into her chair. "Pleasant things are often the most instructive." Across the room, Mrs. Wickliffe was already seated. The needles moved. The counting continued. Clara took her place and tried, quite deliberately, not to watch. The conversation drifted as it had before, though Clara began to notice its curious shape. It was not aimless. Rather, it circled, returning to certain subjects with subtle variation, as though testing how they sounded each time. Patterns, mistakes, corrections. Miss Grant spoke at length about a shawl she had unravelled 3 times. It was not wrong, precisely, she said, frowning slightly as she worked, but it did not feel right. There is a difference, you see. One can follow a pattern exactly and still produce something that does not belong to itself. Mrs. Pembroke nodded with unusual seriousness. "Yes, I've often thought that. One senses when a thing has gone astray, even if one cannot immediately say how." Clara glanced at Mrs. Wickliffe. The counting had not faltered, yet there was a faint tightening at the corner of her mouth, quickly concealed. Miss Marple, seated beside Clara, folded her hands over her knitting with a thoughtful air. "It is the most interesting distinction," she said. "In St. Mary Mead there was a young man, Peter Larkin, who kept his accounts with extraordinary accuracy. Every figure is correct, every sum balanced, and yet, when the matter came to light, it turned out that he had been stealing from his employer for years. Not through error, you understand, but through a sort of rearrangement. Everything was correct, and yet everything was wrong." Mrs. Dalrymple gave a small, amused sound. "That seems almost contradictory." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but people are very fond of contradictions. They allow one to appear one thing while being quite another." Her eyes moved, almost absently, toward Mrs. Wickliffe, then back again. The disturbance that day was quieter. No unravelling, no misplaced tools. Instead, it was Mrs. Pembroke's pattern. She held it up with a puzzled expression, turning the paper slightly as though it might reveal its meaning at a different angle. "I am certain," she said slowly, "that this was not how it was written yesterday. There is a line missing, or perhaps it has been altered. I cannot quite decide which." Mrs. Dalrymple leaned forward. "Surely that is impossible. Paper does not change itself." "No," Mrs. Pembroke replied, her voice thinner than before, "but something has." The remark hung in the room, not dramatic, not alarming, simply present. Clara felt, rather than saw, the shift. Mrs. Wickliffe set down her knitting. "Patterns," she said calmly, "are often misunderstood. One imagines they have been altered, when in fact one has simply failed to read them correctly." Mrs. Pembroke flushed. "I'm not in the habit of misreading instructions." "Of course not," Mrs. Wickliffe said gently, "but habits are not guaranteed." There was no sharpness in the exchange, and yet Clara found herself watching both women more closely. Later, as the afternoon thinned toward evening, Clara rose to stretch her legs. She did not intend to return to the courtyard. She told herself this quite firmly, yet she found herself in the same narrow hallway, the same faint metallic scent drifting toward her from the back of the house. The door was closed this time, but not entirely. A sliver of space remained between wood and frame, as though it had been shut with care, but not completely. Clara hesitated. Then very gently she pushed. The courtyard lay quiet, the cracked copper vat dull in the fading light. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed disturbed. And yet there, on the stone beside the shed door, lay a length of yarn. It was not remarkable in itself. A simple strand, pale grey, slightly frayed at one end. But it had been arranged, not dropped, not lost, placed in a loose spiral, as though someone had wound it there deliberately and then stopped midway through the motion. Clara crouched, studying it. It felt absurdly like a message. Behind her, a voice spoke. "You have a tendency," said Miss Marple, "to look at things that others prefer not to see." Clara started, then turned. "I did not mean to pry," she said quickly. "My dear, one rarely means to," Miss Marple replied kindly. "It is simply that certain things invite attention, and certain people are inclined to accept the invitation." She stepped forward, her gaze settling on the spiral of yarn. "How very neat," she murmured. "And yet incomplete. That is always the interesting part, I find, not what has been finished, but what has been left undone." Clara frowned slightly. "Do you think someone put it there?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think," she said, "that people often reveal more in the way they arrange things than in the things themselves. In St. Mary Mead there was a woman, Mrs. Hensley, who took great pride in her flower beds, always perfectly ordered. But one season she left a small corner untended, only a very small space, you understand, and it was that space rather than all the rest that told us something was wrong." "What sort of thing?" Clara asked. "Oh," said Miss Marple lightly, "the sort of thing that one only understands afterward." They returned to the parlour without further comment. The others were preparing to leave. The chairs were adjusted. Yarn was gathered. Conversations concluded themselves with polite finality. Mrs. Wickliffe stood near the window, her expression composed, but her eyes moved briefly, sharply to Clara, and then to Miss Marple. It was not a suspicion, not quite. It was recognition. As Clara stepped out into the street, she felt a curious certainty settle within her. Not that she understood what was happening, not even that anything truly unusual had occurred, but that room, the women, the patterns, all of it, was arranged with a care that went beyond habit, and that somewhere within that arrangement, something had already begun to come undone. Chapter 3. A very reasonable explanation. By the third afternoon, Clara had become aware of a small but significant change in herself. She no longer entered the knitting parlour as a visitor. She entered it as one who had begun, however unwillingly, to listen for what was not being said. That realization did not please her. She had no taste for melodrama, and very little patience for those who liked to embroider ordinary life with fancies. Yet the house in Bath had its own method of persuasion. It asked nothing outright. It merely offered a succession of tidy irregularities, and waited to see whether one had the temperament to notice that tidiness, in excess, is itself a kind of irregularity. The bell gave its small, well-bred ring as she stepped inside. A maid she had seen only once before relieved her of her coat. The girl was young, with a serious brow and hands reddened by washing, and she had the manner of someone determined not to be observed. Clara would have passed on at once, but Miss Marple, who appeared from the sitting-room with the softness of a person arriving accidentally exactly where she intended to be, paused to speak to the girl. "You have very capable fingers," Miss Marple said, looking at the tray in the maid's hands. "One can always tell. There was a housemaid in St. Mary Mead, Edith Cleeve, who could carry a full tea service upstairs without a spoon so much as kissing the saucer, though she had 7 brothers and ought, by rights, to have been as noisy as the rest of them. It is a gift, really, to do things quietly." The girl coloured. "Thank you, miss. Mrs. Wickliffe says quiet work is good work." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "People do say that, though it depends, of course, on the nature of the work." The maid blinked, uncertain whether she had been complimented, warned, or neither. Miss Marple smiled at her in the kindest way imaginable and moved on. Clara followed, feeling once again that slight sensation of having missed the important part of an exchange. The sitting-room had been altered since yesterday. Not greatly. No one else remarked upon it at first. Yet Clara saw at once that the blue wool basket which usually stood beside Mrs. Pembroke's chair had been moved to the far side of the fireplace. One lamp had been turned so that its light fell more directly upon the central table. Most curious of all, a low workstand near the window had disappeared altogether, leaving a pale square on the carpet where its feet had shielded the nap from the sun. Mrs. Wickliffe was arranging a stack of folded patterns with exactness enough to seem casual. "We are a little out of order today," she said. "The chimney in the back room is being inspected and things have had to be shifted. I do hope nobody minds. One must submit to inconvenience when the house requires it." Mrs. Dalrymple settled herself with the resigned elegance of a woman who had spent her life allowing other people's arrangements to prevail while never quite forgiving them. "My dear Eleanor, when a room belongs so entirely to its owner, The rest of us can scarcely claim injury if a chair is moved 3 inches to the left." Mrs. Pembroke gave a tight laugh, provided, of course, one is told why it has been moved. "I have just told you," said Mrs. Wickliffe pleasantly. The little exchange might have ended there, but Miss Grant, who had a way of speaking as if continuing a private argument with herself, looked toward the empty place by the window. "That stand held the white silk basket," she said, "and the white silk basket contained the christening shawl. I only mention it because silk catches soot in a way wool does not." Mrs. Wickliffe's smile did not alter, but Clara saw the pulse at her throat stir once. "The shawl has been put upstairs," she said. "Safely. How sensible," said Miss Marple, taking her seat. "I always think upper rooms are considered safer than they really are. People imagine danger comes in by the front door. Very often it is already in the house, and has been for some time." No one answered that. Mrs. Dalrymple reached for her yarn. Mrs. Pembroke unfolded a pattern with unnecessary force. Mrs. Wickliffe resumed her place by the window and began once again to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. The numbers were not audible across the room. Yet Clara had begun to feel them, like the ticking of a clock heard through a wall. The lesson that afternoon was to be a complicated cable stitch for a gentleman's winter scarf, an unpromising object, Clara thought, made more severe by Mrs. Wickliffe's insistence that true elegance depended upon discipline. "An untidy man," she said, distributing the printed instructions, "is often merely a man whose wife has lost heart. Textures tell one everything. I have always found that." Mrs. Dalrymple gave Clara a sidelong look. "There speaks a woman who has made a religion of neatness." Mrs. Wickliffe inclined her head. Better that than making an excuse of neglect. The words were mild, but they landed with precision. Clara noticed that Mrs. Dalrymple's fingers, usually unhurried, tightened briefly around her needles before releasing them. It occurred to Clara that every woman in the room was engaged in at least 2 activities, knitting what lay in her lap and defending some version of herself from being revised by the others. Miss Marple, after a careful study of the scarf pattern, said, "These written instructions are very clear. One can see that they were copied by a neat hand. I admire that. A hasty hand so often betrays more than the writer intends." Mrs. Wickliffe looked up. "You have a great faith in handwriting, Miss Marple." "Oh, it is not faith," said Miss Marple, "only habit. In St. Mary Mead there was a curate's sister named Lavinia Price, who wrote letters with such extraordinary loops and flourishes that everyone took her for a romantic creature. Then one day a tradesman brought in an old note of hers asking for payment to be delayed. The writing was the same, of course, but the wording, so cold, so exact, so entirely without embarrassment, told a different story. We had all mistaken the decoration for softness." Mrs. Pembroke smiled thinly. "How disappointing people can be." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though perhaps more often one is disappointed in one's own assumptions." That, Clara thought, was aimed at someone, but at whom? Half an hour later the explanation arrived. It came in the person of Mr. Thomas Bellamy, solicitor, who was shown into the room with the subdued respect accorded to a man who visits women's premises only on business, and prefers to seem faintly embarrassed by the necessity. He was in his early 50s, handsome without vanity, and possessed of that sober charm by which certain men inspire trust in households that ought to know better. His hair had gone silver at the temples in a manner that suggested reliability rather than age, and his voice was low and agreeable. "I beg pardon," he said, standing near the door with hat in hand. "I have interrupted the Republic of Industry. Mrs. Wickliffe, your note made the matter sound urgent, and I was already in the neighbourhood." "Not urgent," said Mrs. Wickliffe, though she had gone a shade paler. "Merely practical. We have had these absurd little disturbances, and the members have become unsettled. I thought it best to have a sensible person look over the back premises and reassure everyone that there is, in fact, nothing to alarm them." "An excellent idea," said Mr. Bellamy at once. "Mysteries thrive where maintenance is neglected. A sticking latch, a warped frame, a servant using the wrong cupboard. These things gather drama if left unattended." He smiled at the room in general, and Clara saw at once why he was liked. The smile acknowledged female nerves without quite insulting them. It was protective. It was civilized. It was also, she thought suddenly, very practiced. Mrs. Dalrymple relaxed visibly. "There, you see, a reasonable explanation at last." Mrs. Pembroke said, "One would prefer that reason had arrived before my pattern altered itself." Mr. Bellamy accepted the remark with courteous amusement. "My dear Mrs. Pembroke, paper has 1,000 enemies: heat, damp, inattention, previous folding, and the tragic tendency of people to read one line when they believe themselves to be reading another. If patterns were less like legal documents, I dare say more shawls would be finished." That earned the laugh it was intended to earn. Even Mrs. Wickliffe allowed herself the faintest easing of expression. Miss Marple, who had been examining him over the top of her spectacles with the placid interest of an old lady, contemplating a respectable stranger at a church bazaar, said, Solicitors must find it very useful, knowing how many things can be altered without changing their appearance. Mr. Bellamy turned to her readily. Useful and exhausting, Miss Marple. Most people come to law hoping that words will settle matters. They are always disappointed to discover that words merely reveal where the disagreement lives. How true, said Miss Marple, and how human. He inclined his head. You speak as if the two were inseparable. Aren't they? There was a brief pause, not the sort forbidden by drama, but the entirely ordinary interruption created when one person realizes another has not said anything foolish at all. Mr. Bellamy smiled. I suppose they are. Clara looked from one to the other. Nothing in the exchange was remarkable, yet she had the uncomfortable sense that Miss Marple had taken hold of some invisible thread and given it the smallest test pull. Mr. Bellamy went with Mrs. Wickliffe to inspect the rear courtyard and the dyeing shed. The room, deprived of its axis, loosened at once. Mrs. Dalrymple bent toward Clara. You may set your mind at rest. Thomas Bellamy has managed Eleanor's affairs for years. He is the most dependable of creatures. I should sooner mistrust the mantel clock. Mrs. Pembroke gave one of her little breaths through the nose. Dependable men are very often those in whom other people have placed their untidy matters. It is not always good for them. My dear Maud, you would find symbolism in a teaspoon. I find patterns, said Mrs. Pembroke, and one of them is that reasonable explanations are always introduced just before something becomes unreasonable. Miss Grant, who had been working in silence, said without looking up, The attic boards creak differently when someone is moving the silk basket. Clara stared at her. How could you know that? Miss Grant shrugged one shoulder. I have ears. There was nothing theatrical in the answer. She merely believed it sufficient. When Mrs. Wickliffe and Mr. Bellamy returned, he brought with him the air of a verdict already prepared. He removed his gloves finger by finger and spoke with light certainty. The shed door catches unless lifted as it closes. Anyone failing to do so might think it opened by itself later. The yard wall creates odd drafts, and the back corridor window does not sit properly in its frame. I dare say that accounts for the rest. There is no mystery at all, only an old building asking to be forgiven. Mrs. Dalrymple let out the sort of relieved murmur that belongs less to belief than to preference. She preferred his explanation, and so accepted it. Mrs. Wickliffe said, Thank you, Thomas. I knew you would put the matter to rights. He looked at her for the briefest fraction too long. It was no more than a second. Still, Clara saw something there, a question perhaps, or a warning received and not answered. Then it was gone. My dear Eleanor, he said warmly, one must not allow trivial nonsense to become a habit. Miss Marple lowered her eyes to her knitting. Clara, watching her, saw that she'd made a mistake in the row. Not a real mistake, a deliberate one. She had crossed 2 stitches and then left them uncured as if to mark the place. At leaving time, Clara found herself beside Miss Marple in the narrow hall. Do you believe him? She asked quietly. My dear, said Miss Marple, buttoning her glove, I believe that Mr. Bellamy is a man who has spent a great many years making alarming things sound manageable. Such men are often very useful. They are also sometimes rather dangerous to themselves. You think he lied? I think, said Miss Marple, that he gave a very reasonable explanation. One must always pay special attention to those. Unreasonable conduct attracts notice at once. Reasonable conduct can pass for years. She moved toward the door, then paused. And it is a curious thing, she added, that Mrs. Wickliffe called for a solicitor rather than a locksmith. Clara stood still after Miss Marple had gone. Upstairs, somewhere above the velvet-curtained room and the careful chairs and the baskets moved 3 inches from their places, a floorboard gave a small complaining creak. It sounded to Clara less like an old house settling than like someone taking a step and then deciding not to take another. Chapter 4. Everything that was not said. Clara began, on the 4th day, to notice absences. Not the obvious kind, no empty chairs, no missing voices, but the smaller, more delicate omissions that left a shape behind them. A sentence that stopped just short of conclusion. A glance that ought to have been returned but was not. A question that altered itself midway through being asked. It gave the afternoon a curious texture, as though something had been carefully removed and the room had agreed, silently, not to mention it. Mrs. Wickliffe was not at her usual place by the window when Clara arrived. That, in itself, was sufficient to unsettle the order of things. She has gone upstairs, Mrs. Dalrymple said, as though anticipating the inquiry. A headache, I believe. Eleanor does not indulge them, which makes their appearance all the more significant when they do occur. Mrs. Pembroke gave a small, measured shrug. Or more useful. My dear Maud, Mrs. Dalrymple replied with faint reproof, one does not speak of usefulness in connection with illness. People do not speak of many things, said Mrs. Pembroke. That has never prevented them from being true. Clara took her seat quietly. Without Mrs. Wickliffe's counting, the room felt oddly unmoored, as though a clock had been removed, and no one quite knew how long anything should last. Miss Marple, who had arrived before her, was engaged in what appeared to be a mild struggle with a particularly fine thread. "It always surprises me," she said gently, "how easily delicate things can be mislaid. One thinks one has them secure, and then they are gone, quite without drama." In St. Mary Mead there was a lace collar belonging to Mrs. Broughton. Very proud she was of it, having inherited it from an aunt with strong opinions. She kept it locked in a drawer for years, and then one day, quite without explanation, it was no longer there. No sign of entry, no disturbance, nothing taken but the one thing she valued. It was most instructive. Mrs. Dalrymple leaned forward. "Was it ever found?" "Oh yes," said Miss Marple, "but not where anyone had thought to look." She did not elaborate. Clara noticed that Mrs. Pembroke did not ask further. Instead, she reached for her yarn with unusual care, as though the act of holding something tangible had become suddenly important. The lesson that afternoon lacked its usual clarity. Without Mrs. Wickliffe to direct it, the pattern, some delicate lacework that depended upon tension more than precision, seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. Miss Grant attempted an explanation, though she spoke as if arguing with an invisible opponent. "It is not a matter of counting," she said. "It is a matter of feeling the thread. One must know when to loosen and when to hold. If you follow instructions too closely, you lose the shape entirely." Mrs. Dalrymple smiled. "A philosophy, perhaps, as much as a technique." "Everything is," Miss Grant replied. Clara tried to follow, but her attention wandered. She found herself thinking of the attic, of the silk basket that had been moved upstairs, of the creak that had sounded the previous evening. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably deliberate. It was Miss Marple who spoke again, quietly enough that only Clara heard at first. "One always wonders," she said, "what people choose to keep above their heads." Clara glanced at her. "Above their heads?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, adjusting her thread. "Attics are curious places. They hold what is not required for daily life, but not discarded either. Things one cannot quite part with, and yet cannot quite bear to have close at hand. I have often thought they are less about storage than about distance." She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "And distance, you see, can be a very comforting illusion." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment the maid appeared at the doorway. "Mrs. Wickliffe will receive Miss Henshaw," she said, looking directly at Clara. The room stilled, not overtly, not rudely, but with a subtle withdrawal of attention, as though each woman had suddenly found her own work more pressing. Clara rose, aware that she was being observed without being watched. The staircase to the upper floor was narrower than Clara had expected. It curved tightly, the polished wood worn smooth at the centre where countless feet had passed. The air grew cooler as she ascended, and the faint scent of wool gave way to something sharper. Dust, perhaps, or the dry, papery smell of stored fabric. At the top, the maid gestured toward a half-open door. Clara entered. The attic room was smaller than the parlour below, but more crowded. Shelves lined the walls, holding skeins of silk and fine wool in carefully labelled bundles. A long table stood beneath a slanted window, covered with patterns, some neatly folded, others spread open as though interrupted mid-use. Mrs. Wickliffe sat at the far end of the table. Without her knitting she appeared diminished, not weaker precisely, but less defined, as though the rhythm of her hands had been essential to her presence. "You wish to see me?" Clara asked. Mrs. Wickliffe regarded her steadily. "No," she said, "but you wish to see this room." Clara felt herself flush. "I did not mean—" "My dear Miss Henshaw," Mrs. Wickliffe interrupted gently, "meaning is a luxury. Actions are rather more informative." There was no accusation in her tone, and yet Clara felt as though she had been measured. "I only thought," Clara said carefully, "that it might help me understand the work better." "Yes," said Mrs. Wickliffe, "understanding is always the reason we give." She rose and moved toward one of the shelves, her fingers brushing lightly over the bundles of silk. "You see," she continued, "this is where everything begins. Patterns are not created in the parlour. They are refined there, certainly, but their origin is here, in solitude, in quiet, without interruption." Clara followed her gaze. The room felt different from the parlour, not merely smaller, but more private, as though it held something that had not been arranged for others to see. "And the shawl?" Clara asked before she could stop herself. Mrs. Wickliffe's hand paused. "The christening shawl is safe," she said. "I did not mean to suggest otherwise." "No," Mrs. Wickliffe replied. "You suggested nothing. You merely asked." She turned then, and for the first time Clara saw something unguarded in her expression. Not fear, but something close to it. "There are matters," Mrs. Wickliffe said quietly, "which are better left where they are placed. Disturbance rarely improves them." Clara hesitated. "And if they have already been disturbed?" Mrs. Wickliffe's gaze sharpened. "Then one must decide," she said, "whether to restore the original arrangement or to accept that it can never be as it was." As Clara descended the staircase, she felt an unfamiliar weight settle in her thoughts. The attic had not revealed anything overt, no hidden documents, no obvious secrets, and yet something in Mrs. Wickliffe's manner had shifted, not her composure, That remained intact, but the effort behind it had become visible. When Clara returned to the parlour, the atmosphere had altered again. Mrs. Dalrymple was speaking in low tones to Mrs. Pembroke, her voice carrying just enough to be heard without appearing to intend it, only saying that one does not consult a solicitor over a sticking door. There must be something else, something she has not told us. Mrs. Pembroke replied, "There is always something else." Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting in her lap, though she was not working. Clara took her seat. Miss Marple glanced at her briefly. "Well?" she said. Clara considered her answer. "There is nothing there," she said at last. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "that is often where one begins." The afternoon ended without further incident. No unravelling threads, no misplaced tools, only the steady continuation of work that seemed, somehow, more deliberate than before. As Clara prepared to leave, she noticed that the blue wool basket had been returned to its original place by the fireplace. No one remarked upon it. No one claimed to have moved it. And yet there it was, exactly where it had always been. Outside, the evening light had softened the edges of the street, giving the houses a gentler aspect than they possessed by day. Miss Marple joined Clara at the gate. "You have been upstairs," she said, not as a question. "Yes, and you found nothing of interest." Clara hesitated. "Nothing I can explain," Miss Marple nodded. "That is a very honest answer. Explanations have a way of arriving later, sometimes long after they are useful." She paused, then added, "It is not what is hidden that concerns me. It is what has been arranged to appear unremarkable." Clara looked back at the house, at the windows, the door, the quiet, orderly facade, everything in its place, nothing out of order, and yet she could not shake the feeling that something within had already shifted, something that could not, no matter how carefully it was managed, be put back as it had been, and that someone, somewhere in that house, I knew it. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Poured. Too carefully. Clara did not intend to arrive early, yet she found herself at the door a full quarter hour before the usual hour, her gloved hand hovering just long enough to acknowledge that she had made a choice she could not entirely justify. The maid admitted her with the same quiet efficiency as before, though this time there was a faint flush to the girl's face, as though she had been moving quickly and had not quite recovered her breath. "You are early, miss," she said. "Yes," Clara replied, aware of the inadequacy. I wish to begin properly today." The girl nodded, though her eyes flickered briefly toward the staircase. Clara noticed. The parlour was not yet arranged. This, more than anything else, unsettled her. The velvet chair stood slightly askew. A skein of pale blue wool had slipped from its place and lay coiled on the floor like something abandoned rather than misplaced. The lamp near the fireplace had not been lit, and the room held that curious half-light in which objects appear both ordinary and uncertain. Mrs. Wickliffe stood at the central table. She was not knitting. Instead, she was pouring tea. The act itself was unremarkable, yet there was something in the way she performed it, something measured beyond necessity. She lifted the teapot with both hands, aligning it precisely over each cup before allowing the tea to fall in a narrow, steady stream. Not a drop spilled, not a motion wasted. Clara watched, and understood suddenly that this was not merely a habit, it was controlled. Mrs. Wickliffe looked up. "You are early, Miss Henshaw," she said. "I hope I am not intruding." "On the contrary," Mrs. Wickliffe replied, setting the teapot down with care. "It is useful from time to time to see a room before it has been arranged." Clara hesitated. "And what does one learn from that?" Mrs. Wickliffe considered the question. "One learns," she said slowly, "how much effort an arrangement requires." There was no pride in the statement, only a quiet acknowledgement. The others arrived in their usual sequence, though Clara began to notice that even their entrances followed a pattern. Mrs. Dalrymple first, composed and faintly expectant. Mrs. Pembroke shortly after, her expression already sharpened by some private dissatisfaction. Miss Grant last, as though she had only just remembered that the world required her presence. Miss Marple entered almost unnoticed. She took her place with a small nod to Clara, and began at once to examine her knitting, though Clara had the distinct impression that she was observing everything else. The tea was poured. Clara found herself watching Mrs. Wickliffe's hands again. Each cup was placed before its intended recipient with exact positioning. The handle turned at a precise angle, the saucer aligned with the edge of the table. It was, Clara thought, a performance of order. Mrs. Dalrymple accepted her cup with approval. "You make even tea seem deliberate, Eleanor." "Everything benefits from attention," Mrs. Wickliffe replied. Mrs. Pembroke lifted her cup, then set it down again without drinking. "You have changed the blend," she said. It was not a question. Mrs. Wickliffe's expression did not alter. "I have used what was available." "That is not the same thing," Mrs. Pembroke replied quietly. A small silence followed. Not the dramatic kind, but the sort that settles when something has been said that cannot easily be withdrawn. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "It is curious," she said, "how sensitive we become to small alterations. In St. Mary Mead, there was a widow, Mrs. Elmsworth, who served the same jam at every gathering for nearly 20 years. When she changed it, even slightly, everyone noticed at once. They could not have said why, only that it was no longer quite what they expected." Mrs. Dalrymple smiled. "And was there a reason for the change?" "Oh yes," said Miss Marple, "though not the one anyone supposed." She took a small sip of tea. "And that, I think, is usually the case. The lesson that afternoon was abandoned almost before it began. Miss Grant attempted to explain a new pattern, but her voice lacked conviction, and the others followed with only partial attention. Threads slipped, counts were lost. Even Mrs. Wickliffe, Marie, who ordinarily corrected such lapses with gentle precision, allowed them to pass. Clara felt it then, the shift, not dramatic, not visible, but present. The room had begun to resist its own order. It was Mrs. Pembroke who first spoke of it directly. "I would like to see the attic again," she said, her tone deliberately neutral, "if only to reassure myself that everything is as it ought to be." Mrs. Dalrymple frowned slightly. "My dear, we are not inspectors. Eleanor has already assured us—" "I am aware of what Eleanor has assured us," Mrs. Pembroke interrupted. "I am also aware that assurance is not the same as evidence." Mrs. Wickliffe set down her cup. "I see no reason," she said calmly, "to disturb what has already been settled." "And I see no reason," Mrs. Pembroke replied. "It is just to accept what has not been shown. The exchange might have escalated, but it did not. Instead, it lingered, unfinished, unresolved, like a thread left deliberately unknotted. Later, as the afternoon drew toward its quiet conclusion, Clara found herself once again in the narrow hallway. She had not intended to go there. She told herself this, even as her feet carried her forward. The door to the courtyard stood closed, this time firmly, yet the metallic scent remained, stronger now, as though something had been disturbed and not entirely settled again. Clara reached for the handle and stopped, not because she heard anything, but because she felt something, a presence perhaps, or the absence of one. She could not say, only that the space beyond the door seemed to hold a different weight than before. Behind her, footsteps approached. Clara turned. It was Mr. Bellamy. He carried his hat in one hand, his expression composed, though there was a faint tightness at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Henshaw," he said pleasantly, "you seem to have developed an interest in the less frequented parts of the house." Clara felt a flicker of unease. "I was only curious," he finished for her. "Yes, it is a natural inclination." He stepped closer, his gaze resting briefly on the door. "There is nothing of consequence out there," he said. "Old spaces have a way of inviting imagination. One does best to leave them alone." Clara met his eyes. "And if one does not?" Mr. Bellamy smiled. "Then one must be prepared," he said, "to find that imagination is not always the most dangerous thing waiting." They returned to the parlour together. No one remarked upon their absence. No one asked where they had been, and yet Clara felt quite distinctly that something had been noted, something added to an account she could not see. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple rose beside her. "You've had an interesting conversation," she said quietly. Clara glanced at her. "You know that?" "My dear," Miss Marple replied, "people who wish to appear unremarkable often take great care with their words. It becomes noticeable." She paused, then added, "In St. Mary Mead, there was a gentleman who always spoke in the most reassuring manner. One felt calmer simply listening to him. It was only later that we realized he had never once said anything that could be held against him." Clara frowned. "That sounds admirable." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it did." She looked back at the house. At first, Clara stepped out into the evening with a growing certainty she could no longer dismiss. The disturbances were not accidents, the order was not natural, and the explanations, however reasonable they sounded, were beginning to feel like something else entirely, something placed, carefully, as though to ensure that no one would look too closely at what had already begun to unravel. Chapter 6. What Solicitors Know and When. Clara found, on the 6th afternoon, that she'd begun to measure time differently, not by hours or obligations, but by what had been said, and more precisely by what had not. It was a subtle change, yet it altered everything. Conversations no longer passed without weight. Silences no longer felt empty. Even the smallest remark seemed to carry a second meaning, one that revealed itself only after the moment had moved on. She entered the parlour with that awareness already in place. The room was arranged again, perfectly, chairs restored, baskets aligned. The lamp by the fireplace lit at precisely the angle that cast a gentle glow without shadowing the central table. Mrs. Wickliffe sat by the window knitting, counting. Clara felt an odd relief at the sound, though she could not have said why. Mrs. Dalrymple greeted her with a brightness that seemed slightly overdone. "My dear Miss Henshaw, "We are quite restored today. Everything has returned to its proper place. It is astonishing how quickly disorder can be corrected when one applies oneself." Mrs. Pembroke, already seated, gave a soft, almost private laugh. "Yes," she said, "provided one knows exactly what was out of place to begin with." The remark drifted through the room without landing. Mrs. Wickliffe did not look up. Miss Marple was examining a skein of pale green wool. "It is a curious shade," she observed. "Not quite what it appears to be at first glance. In certain light it looks almost grey, and in others quite vivid. One wonders which is the true colour." Miss Grant, without lifting her eyes, replied, "It depends where you place it." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that is often the case." Clara sat beside her, her thoughts already turning toward the conversation she had had with Mr. Bellamy the previous afternoon. There had been something in his manner, something carefully balanced. Not evasive, but controlled. She glanced toward Mrs. Wickliffe. The counting continued, steady, unbroken. The lesson began, though without its usual focus. Threads slipped, patterns faltered. It was not incompetence. Clara sensed that clearly. It was a distraction. Each woman seemed to be listening for something beyond the immediate moment, and not finding it. Mr. Bellamy arrived again, this time without announcement. The maid simply opened the door, and he stepped inside with the easy familiarity of someone accustomed to entering without question. "I trust I do not intrude," he said, though it was evident that he did not expect contradiction. Mrs. Wickliffe looked up. "You never intrude, Thomas," she said. The words were warm, but Clara noticed that her hands had stilled, only for a moment. Then the counting resumed. Mr. Bellamy moved further into the room, his presence altering the atmosphere in a way that Clara could not immediately define. It was not uncomfortable, not quite, but the careful equilibrium of the parlour seemed to adjust itself around him, as though accommodating a weight that had not been anticipated. "I thought it best to confirm that yesterday's minor concerns have been fully resolved," he said. "One prefers not to leave such matters lingering. They tend to acquire significance out of proportion to their cause." Mrs. Dalrymple nodded with satisfaction. "Quite right. I have already remarked that everything feels entirely as it should." Mrs. Pembroke did not respond. She was watching him, closely. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "It must be very useful," she said gently, "to know when a matter has been resolved." Mr. Bellamy smiled. "It is, Miss Marple, though one must be careful not to assume resolution where there is only delay." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Yes, that is a distinction worth making." There was a brief pause, not empty but occupied by thought. Clara saw Mrs. Wickliffe's fingers tighten slightly on her needles. Mr. Bellamy turned his attention to the table. "I have also taken the liberty," he said, "of reviewing certain documents related to the property, purely as a precaution. Old houses sometimes conceal irregularities." Mrs. Dalrymple leaned forward. "Irregularities of what sort?" "Structural, mostly," he replied smoothly, "though occasionally one finds discrepancies in records. Ownership, alterations, additions made without proper notation." Mrs. Pembroke spoke then. "And have you found any such discrepancies here?" Mr. Bellamy's expression did not change. "Nothing of consequence," he said. The answer was immediate. Too immediate. Clara felt it. Not the words themselves, but the speed. Miss Marple folded her hands. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a solicitor who was much admired for his efficiency. He answered every question at once without hesitation. People found it most reassuring, until, of course, they realized that he had been answering the question he expected rather than the one that had been asked." Mrs. Dalrymple gave a small, uncertain laugh. "That seems a rather serious flaw." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it was." Her gaze rested briefly on Mr. Bellamy. Then I moved away. The conversation shifted, though not entirely. Clara found herself watching Mr. Bellamy more closely. He spoke easily, moving between subjects with practiced ease, offering small observations that reassured without revealing. Yet there was something, a carefulness, not in what he said, but in what he did not. It was Miss Grant who spoke next, unexpectedly. "The attic boards creak differently today," she said. The room stilled. Mr. Bellamy turned toward her. "In what way?" he asked. "They are quieter," she replied, "as though something has been moved, or removed." Mrs. Wickliffe's knitting stopped, for a full second, then resumed. Mr. Bellamy smiled. "Old houses settle," he said. "It is their nature to change slightly from day to day. One must not read too much into it." Miss Grant shrugged. "I do not read, I listen." The moment passed, or seemed to, but Clara felt it remained, like a thread drawn too tight. Later, as the afternoon waned, Clara found herself again in the hallway. She did not question it now. The pull was too clear. The door to the courtyard was closed, but not locked. She knew this without testing it. She turned the handle. The door opened. The courtyard lay still. The cracked copper vat caught the fading light. And there, near the base of the shed door, it was the spiral of yarn. Not the same as before. This one was darker, tighter, more deliberate. Clara stepped closer. and saw that the end of the thread had been tucked beneath itself, secured, as though someone had taken care to ensure it would not come undone. Behind her, a voice spoke. "You're persistent." Clara turned. Mrs. Wickliffe stood in the doorway. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were not. "I did not mean," Clara began. "No," Mrs. Wickliffe said gently. "You rarely do." She stepped forward, her gaze moving to the spiral of yarn. "It is remarkable," she said, "how people assign meaning to arrangements." Clara hesitated. "You do not think it means anything?" Mrs. Wickliffe smiled. "I think," she said, "that meaning is something we create when we are unwilling to accept simplicity." Clara looked at her, at the composed face, the steady voice, the careful words, and for the first time she wondered, not what Mrs. Wickliffe was hiding, but what she was trying to hold in place. That evening, as Clara walked away from the house, she found herself replaying the day's conversations. Mr. Bellamy's certainty, Miss Grant's quiet observations, Miss Marple's gentle remarks, and beneath it all, a pattern, not visible, not yet, but present. Miss Marple joined her at the gate. "You have noticed something," she said. Clara nodded slowly. "I am not sure what." Miss Marple smiled. "My dear, certainty is very often the last thing to arrive. One must learn to trust the earlier stages." She paused, then added, "It is not always what solicitors know that matters." Clara looked at her. "What then?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "It is when they choose to know it." Chapter 7. The Shape of What Remained. Clara did not sit down at once that afternoon. She stood just inside the parlour, aware, more acutely than before, of how every object occupied its place not by accident, but by decision. The chairs were aligned again with almost mathematical care. The yarn cabinets held their contents in perfect gradients. Even the faint indentation on the carpet where the missing stand had once rested seemed less like a mark left behind and more like a memory that refused to be entirely erased. Something had been removed, that much was certain. What remained was the shape of it. Mrs. Wickliffe was already seated, her knitting in hand. Though the rhythm had changed, Clara noticed it immediately. The counting was still there, soft, controlled, but it lacked its previous ease. There was a faint hesitation between numbers, as though each one required a fraction more attention than before. It was the smallest alteration, and yet Clara felt it as distinctly as if a note in a familiar melody had shifted out of tune. Mrs. Dalrymple, by contrast, seemed determined to restore normality through conversation. "My dear Miss Henshaw," she said brightly, "we are quite ourselves again today. It is extraordinary how quickly one adapts when matters are properly explained. I always say that uncertainty is the true enemy of comfort." Mrs. Pembroke did not look up. "Comfort," she said quietly, "is often the enemy of understanding." Mrs. Dalrymple gave a faint sigh. "You persist in that view, Maud, though I have never found it particularly useful." "No," said Mrs. Pembroke, "it rarely is." Miss Marple sat beside Clara, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. "It is curious," she said, "how people prefer a complete explanation, even if it is incorrect, to an incomplete one that might lead them closer to the truth." Clara glanced at her. "Do you think we have been given a complete explanation?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think," she said, "we have been given an explanation that satisfies certain needs, and not others?" Miss Marple's eyes moved toward Mrs. Wickliffe. "Not the important ones." The lesson that afternoon did not begin at all. Mrs. Wickliffe made a small, almost apologetic gesture with her hand. "I find," she said, "that today may not be suited to instruction. We shall continue our individual work instead." No one objected, and yet the absence of structure made the room feel exposed. Without the guiding pattern, each woman was left with her own. It was Miss Grant who spoke first. "The attic is empty," she said. The words fell into the room with quiet certainty. Mrs. Dalrymple frowned. "Empty? That is hardly possible." Miss Grant shrugged. "Something has been taken away." Mrs. Pembroke looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Miss Grant replied, "that the boards do not sound the same. There is less weight." Mrs. Dalrymple gave a small laugh. "My dear, you cannot possibly determine such a thing from the sound of a floor." Miss Grant did not respond. She did not need to. Clara felt the shift again. Stronger this time. Not merely an absence, but a change in balance. "Mrs." Wickliffe set down her knitting. "For heaven's sake," she said, her voice still calm but carrying a faint edge, "must we persist in these interpretations? The attic has been reorganised. Nothing more." Mrs. Pembroke leaned forward. "Reorganised," she repeated, "and we were not told." "There was no need to tell you," Mrs. Wickliffe replied. "There is always a need to tell," said Mrs. Pembroke, "when something is changed." The two women regarded one another, not openly hostile, but no longer aligned. Miss Marple spoke then, gently. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a family who rearranged their drawing-room every few years, quite dramatically. Furniture moved, pictures replaced, colours altered. They said it was to keep things fresh. but one noticed that each change coincided with something else, something less visible. Mrs. Dalrymple looked intrigued despite herself. What sort of thing? Miss Marple adjusted her glasses. A disagreement, she said. A difficulty. Something that could not be resolved directly. So it was resolved indirectly by altering the surroundings. It gave the impression that everything had changed, when in fact nothing had. She paused. And that, of course, is the difficulty with rearrangement. It can conceal as much as it reveals. The room settled again, but not comfortably. Mr. Bellamy did not appear that afternoon. His absence was noted, though not remarked upon. Clara found herself aware of it in a way that surprised her. It was not that she expected him, but his presence had become part of the pattern, and now he was missing. Later, as the light began to fade, Clara rose once more. She did not hesitate. She moved toward the hallway with a certainty she no longer questioned. The door to the courtyard was locked, this time unmistakably. The handle did not turn. Clara stood still. The metallic scent lingered, faint but present. She placed her hand against the wood. It felt cool, solid, final. Miss Henshaw. Clara turned. Mrs. Wickliffe stood behind her. There was no knitting in her hands, no pretense of occupation, only stillness. "You are very persistent," she said. Clara met her gaze. "I think something has been moved," she said. Mrs. Wickliffe's expression did not change. "Yes," she said, "it has, and you do not wish us to know what." Mrs. Wickliffe stepped closer. "I do not wish," she said quietly, "for unnecessary attention to be drawn to matters that are already settled." Clara hesitated. "Are they settled?" For the first time, and Mrs. Wickliffe did not answer immediately. "They must be," she said at last. The words were precise, carefully chosen, and entirely unconvincing. Clara felt it then, not understanding, not yet, but something very close to it. That evening, Miss Marple walked with her to the gate once more. "The attic is empty," Clara said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." "And the courtyard is locked." "Yes." Clara stopped. "What has been moved?" Miss Marple considered her for a moment. "My dear," she said, "that is not the right question." Clara frowned. "Then what is?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "The right question," she said, "is why it was moved now." Clara looked back at the house, at the windows, the door, the careful, deliberate order, and she understood, not the answer, but the direction. Something had been hidden, or something had been arranged, and now something had been removed. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a gentleman who kept a locked cabinet in his study. No one knew what it contained, but everyone assumed it must be valuable. When it was finally opened, after his death, it was found to be empty. Quite entirely empty." Clara blinked. "Then why keep it locked?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because," she said, "people will protect an empty space just as fiercely as a full one if they believe it contains something worth hiding." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air, and as she turned away, she realized that whatever had been removed from the attic was not the most important thing that had been there. Chapter 8. What was taken and what was left. Clara arrived later than usual, not by accident, not by delay, but by decision. She wished, though she would not have admitted it, to see the house after it had settled into itself, to observe what remained when the careful performance of order had already begun. There was, she had come to believe, a difference between what was arranged for others to see and what revealed itself once the arrangement was underway. The maid admitted her with a glance that lingered slightly longer than before. "Mrs. Wickliffe has asked that we begin without waiting," she said. Clara inclined her head. "That is quite reasonable." The word sounded different now. The parlour was already in use. Mrs. Dalrymple spoke with animation, her voice carrying the faint brightness of someone determined to maintain a certain version of events. And I maintain that it is entirely unnecessary to concern oneself further. The matter has been explained, the house put in order, and there is no advantage in revisiting what has already been resolved." Mrs. Pembroke, seated opposite, did not look at her. "There is always an advantage," she said, "in understanding why something requires explanation in the first place." Miss Grant worked silently. Her needles moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as though she were listening through her hands rather than her ears. Mrs. Wickliffe sat by the window, counting, but Clara saw at once the rhythm had changed again. There were pauses now, small, irregular interruptions, not enough to be remarked upon, but enough to be felt. Miss Marple greeted Clara with a small nod. "You have chosen a different hour," she said. "Yes. And you hope to see something new?" Clara hesitated. "I'm not sure." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is usually when one does." The conversation moved, though without direction. Clara noticed that no one mentioned the attic, or the courtyard, or the absence of Mr. Bellamy. These omissions were not accidental. They were shared, agreed upon. It was Mrs. Pembroke who broke it. "Has Mr. Bellamy concluded his inspections?" she asked, her tone light but deliberate. Mrs. Wickliffe did not look up. "There is nothing further to inspect," she said. "And yet," Mrs. Pembroke replied, "he has not returned." Mrs. Dalrymple gave a small, impatient sigh. "My dear Maud, must you persist? Mr. Bellamy is a busy man. He cannot be expected to attend to us daily." "No," said Mrs. Pembroke, "but one might expect him to complete what he began." Mrs. Wickliffe's needles paused, only for a moment, then resumed. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a gentleman who undertook to repair a roof. He began with great energy, ladders, tools, and much consultation, and then, quite suddenly, he stopped, left the work incomplete, said it was no longer necessary." Mrs. Dalrymple frowned. "That seems most irresponsible." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it did, particularly when it rained." Her gaze moved briefly to Mrs. Wickliffe. Clara felt the pressure building, not outwardly, but within the room itself, as though something unspoken had reached a point where it could no longer remain entirely contained. It was Miss Grant who spoke again. "The shed door has been opened," she said. Mrs. Dalrymple turned. "That is impossible. It was locked." Miss Grant did not look up. "It has been opened." Clara felt it then. A sharp, unmistakable shift. Mrs. Wickliffe set down her knitting. "Who has been to the courtyard?" she asked. No one answered. Not immediately. Clara spoke. "I went yesterday," she said. Mrs. Wickliffe's gaze moved to her. "And today?" "No." Miss Grant lifted her head. "It was opened this morning," she said, "before we arrived." Mrs. Dalrymple laughed, though the sound was thinner than before. "My dear Miss Grant, you cannot possibly know that." Miss Grant shrugged. "I can hear the difference," she said. The room fell quiet, not dramatically, but completely. Mrs. Wickliffe rose. "I shall see to it," she said. Her voice was steady, controlled, but Clara saw the effort behind it. She moved toward the hallway. Clara hesitated, then followed. The corridor felt narrower than before. The air is heavier, the metallic scent stronger. The door stood slightly open, not wide, just enough. Mrs. Wickliffe stopped. For a moment she didn't move. Then she stepped forward and pushed the door fully open. The courtyard lay before them, still, unchanged, and yet different. The cracked copper vat caught the light. The stone beneath it, bare. The spiral of yarn, gone. Clara felt a strange, hollow certainty. Not surprising, not confusion, but recognition. Mrs. Wickliffe stepped into the courtyard, slowly, carefully, as though each movement required consideration. She looked at the ground, at the space where the yarn had been, at the shed door. "It appears," she said quietly, "that someone has been here." Clara watched her, and understood that this was not new information. Behind them, Miss Marple's voice sounded, soft, measured. "One always wonders," she said, "what is taken and what is left behind." Mrs. Wickliffe did not turn. Clara spoke. "The yarn is gone." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And that matters?" Miss Marple considered. "My dear, it depends on whether the yarn was the thing itself or merely a sign of it." Mrs. Wickliffe turned then. Her expression was composed, but her eyes, sharp, focused. "There is nothing here of consequence," she said. The words were precise, deliberate. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course," she said. Clara felt the moment pass, not resolved, not explained, but moved. As they returned to the parlour, Clara noticed something else, something small, almost insignificant. The blue wool basket was no longer by the fireplace. It had been moved again. No one mentioned it. No one looked at it. And yet Clara knew that it had not moved by accident. That evening, as she walked away from the house, she found herself thinking not of what had been taken, but of what remained. The attic, empty. The courtyard, disturbed. The patterns, altered, and the explanations, still carefully in place. Miss Marple walked beside her. "You're beginning to see it," she said. Clara nodded slowly. "I think something has been removed to prevent it from being found." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "That is often the case." Clara hesitated. "Then what are we looking for?" Miss Marple stopped. She turned, her gaze resting on the house. "My dear," she said gently, "we are not looking for what was taken." Clara frowned. "Then what?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "We are looking," she said, "for the reason it had to be taken now." Chapter 9. The Hour That Did Not Fit. Clara did not go in at once. She stood across the street pretending to examine the window of a small antiquarian shop that displayed its wares with a kind of hopeful disorder. Books leaning against one another as though in conversation. A chipped porcelain dog placed with more affection than value. It was not the sort of arrangement Mrs. Wickliffe would have tolerated. That, Clara thought, was precisely why she lingered. She was trying, though she did not quite admit it, to understand what the knitting parlour would look like if nothing were controlled. When she finally crossed the street and entered, she found the house already in motion, but not in its usual way. The parlour door stood open. Voices carried, low, uneven, or not arranged for listening. Clara paused in the hallway and heard, "It cannot be left like this," Mrs. Pembroke was saying. Her voice had lost its measured restraint. It held something sharper now. "You cannot simply remove things and expect the rest of us to pretend nothing has altered," Mrs. Dalrymple answered quickly. "You exaggerate. There is no evidence that anything of importance has been removed. We are speaking of impressions, of suggestions. We are speaking," Mrs. Pembroke interrupted, "of deliberate actions." Clara stepped inside. The conversation stopped, not abruptly, but with a kind of practised adjustment, as though it had been folded away. Mrs. Wickliffe sat by the window, knitting, counting, but Clara saw it immediately. The rhythm was wrong, not merely hesitant, disjointed. There were gaps now, places where the count should have continued, but I did not. Miss Marple sat opposite her, her hands folded over her work. "You have arrived at the most instructive moment," she said gently. Clara took her seat. "I did not mean to interrupt." "My dear," Miss Marple replied, "interruption is often the only way one learns what was truly being said." No one resumed the previous discussion. Instead, the room settled into a quieter pattern. But it was not the same. Clara felt it at once, the absence of something that had previously held everything together. It was Miss Grant who spoke first. "The attic is not empty," she said. Mrs. Dalrymple gave a small, impatient sound. "We have already established that it has been reorganized." "No," Miss Grant said. "It is not empty, but it is not the same." Mrs. Pembroke looked at her. "In what way?" Miss Grant's needles paused. "There is something missing," she said, "but not weight." Clara felt a sudden clarity, not understanding, but direction. Mrs. Wickliffe set down her knitting. "For heaven's sake," she said, her voice controlled but no longer entirely calm, "must we persist in this? There is nothing in the attic that concerns any of you." Mrs. Pembroke leaned forward. "That is precisely the point," she said. Miss Marple spoke quietly. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a woman who kept a locked box in her bedroom. Everyone assumed it contained something valuable, jewellery perhaps, letters, something worth protecting. When it was finally opened, it held nothing but old scraps of paper, receipts, notes, fragments of lists, entirely worthless." Mrs. Dalrymple frowned. "Then why keep it locked?" Miss Marple adjusted her glasses. "Because," she said, "the value was not in the contents. It was in the belief that something important was being hidden." The room fell still. Clara looked at Mrs. Wickliffe and saw, not fear, but strain. "You are suggesting," Mrs. Wickliffe said slowly, "that there is nothing in the attic." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I am suggesting," she said, "that what matters is not what is there now." The words settled, not as an answer, but as a question. Mr. Bellamy arrived, without announcement, without hesitation. He entered the room as though nothing had changed, as though the pattern remained intact. "I trust," he said pleasantly, "that all concerns have been laid to rest." Mrs. Pembroke did not respond. Mrs. Dalrymple smiled, though it did not reach her eyes. We were just discussing that very point," she said. Mr. Bellamy inclined his head. "And what conclusion have you reached?" Mrs. Pembroke spoke. "That the conclusion may have been reached too quickly." Mr. Bellamy's expression did not alter. "My dear Mrs. Pembroke," he said, "one must be careful not to create difficulties where none exist." Clara felt it then, the shift, not in the room, in him. Miss Marple watched him, closely. "It is a curious thing," she said, "how often difficulties are not created but revealed." Mr. Bellamy turned to her. "And how does one distinguish between the two?" Miss Marple smiled. "By observing," she said, "when the difficulty appears." Clara saw it, a flicker, small, but unmistakable. Mr. Bellamy recovered at once. "I should think," he said lightly, "that difficulties appear when people begin to look for them." Miss Marple shook her head. "No," she said, "they appear when people begin to stop looking away." The room held that moment, briefly. Then it moved. Clara found herself rising, without planning to, without deciding. "I would like to see the attic," she said. The words surprised her, but once spoken they remained. Mrs. Wickliffe stood. "No," she said. The refusal was immediate, absolute. Clara felt it, the certainty. "Why not?" she asked. Mrs. Wickliffe's gaze fixed on her. "Because there is nothing there," she said. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Then there would be no harm in looking." Mrs. Wickliffe did not answer. Mr. Bellamy stepped forward. "I must advise against it," he said. "The attic is not part of the parlour, it is a private space." Clara turned to him. "And yet it affects what happens here." For a moment no one spoke. Then Miss Grant rose. "I will go," she said. The simplicity of it, the quiet certainty, shifted something. Mrs. Pembroke stood as well. "As will I." Mrs. Dalrymple hesitated, then followed. Clara moved. Miss Marple beside her. Mrs. Wickliffe did not stop them. That, more than anything, told Clara they were right. The staircase felt different, narrower, heavier. The attic door stood closed. Miss Grant reached for the handle, paused, then I opened it. The room beyond was as Clara remembered. Shelves, bundles, patterns, but not the same. Clara stepped inside, slowly, carefully, and saw at once what had changed. Not what was missing, but what remained. On the table, among the scattered patterns, it was a single sheet of paper, not folded, not hidden, left. Clara moved toward it. Her hand hovered. Then she picked it up and understood nothing. The page held only a pattern, a knitting pattern, precise, carefully written, but incomplete. The final lines missing. Clara looked up. Miss Marple was watching her. "My dear," she said gently, "what is left behind is very often the thing one is meant to find." Clara looked back at the paper, at the missing lines, and for the first time she realized this was not about what had been taken. It was about what had been left, on purpose. Chapter 10. The Pattern That Refused to Finish. Clara held the paper longer than she realized. It was not remarkable, at least not at first glance. A pattern written in a firm, deliberate hand. The instructions were clear, orderly, entirely consistent with the sort of work Mrs. Wycliffe had cultivated so carefully. Rows marked with neat abbreviations, small corrections made with an exactness that suggested revision rather than error. And yet it stopped. Not abruptly, not as though interrupted in haste, but with a peculiar neatness. The final instruction trailed into a blank space that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. Clara lowered the page. Behind her, the others had entered the attic. Mrs. Pembroke moved toward the shelves, her eyes searching not for something specific, Clara thought, but for confirmation of something already suspected. Mrs. Dalrymple stood near the doorway, her posture uncertain for the first time since Clara had known her, as though the room itself required a different kind of composure than she possessed. Miss Grant did not move at all. She stood just inside the threshold, listening. "It is exactly as I said," Mrs. Wycliffe's voice came from behind them. Clara turned. Mrs. Wycliffe stood in the doorway, her expression composed. "There is nothing here of consequence." The words were familiar now, too familiar. Clara looked down at the paper again. "This is incomplete," she said. Mrs. Wycliffe's gaze flickered, only briefly, then steadied. "Many patterns are revised," she said. "One does not always record every variation." "This is not a variation," Clara replied quietly. "It ends without finishing." Mr. Bellamy spoke then, his tone measured. "My dear Miss Henshaw, you must understand that not every unfinished thing carries significance. Sometimes a pattern is abandoned because it proves unsatisfactory. There is no mystery in that." Clara looked at him. "No," she said, "there is not." She paused. "Unless someone has taken care to leave it behind." The words settled into the room, not dramatically, but with weight. Miss Marple stepped forward. "May I?" she said gently. Clara handed her the paper. Miss Marple examined it with quiet attention, her fingers resting lightly on the page as though feeling its texture might reveal something the eye could not. "It is a very neat hand," she said, "and a very careful one. One sees that the writer did not like to leave things uncertain." She turned the page slightly. "And yet here we are." Mrs. Dalrymple gave a small, strained laugh. "My dear Miss Marple, you speak as though the paper has intentions." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh no," she said. "The paper does nothing at all. It is people who arrange what is left upon it." Clara watched Mrs. Wycliffe. For the first time, there was no stillness. Mrs. Wycliffe stepped into the room. "That is enough," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried something new, something that had not been there before. "This has gone quite far enough," she continued. "There is nothing in this room that concerns any of you. I have allowed these explorations out of courtesy, but courtesy has its limits." Mrs. Pembroke turned. "Courtesy?" she said. "Is that what you call it?" Mr. Bellamy moved slightly closer. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "perhaps it would be best." She did not look at him. "No," she said. The refusal was not loud, but it was final. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully. "Of course," she said, "we would not wish to intrude." She handed it back to Clara. Clara hesitated. Then I took it. The moment passed, but not entirely. They returned to the parlour. Something had changed. Not in the arrangement. Everything remained precisely where it should be. But the room, it felt different. Clara sat down slowly. The paper rested in her hands. She did not look at it again. Not yet. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but Clara noticed she was not following the pattern. After a time, Miss Marple spoke. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a woman who wrote recipes in a little notebook. Very precise, very orderly. Every ingredient listed, every step recorded. And yet when one followed them exactly, the results were never quite right." Mrs. Dalrymple smiled faintly. "How curious." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it was, until one realized that she had deliberately omitted one small step from each recipe. Clara felt it, a sudden, quiet certainty. Mrs. Pembroke leaned forward. "Why would she do that?" Miss Marple adjusted her glasses. "Because," she said, "the recipes were not meant to be used. They were meant to be read." Clara looked down at the paper in her hands. The incomplete pattern, the missing lines. "This was never meant to be finished," she said. Miss Marple smiled. "No," she said, "it was meant to be found." The room held that realization. Mr. Bellamy spoke then, his tone careful. "And what exactly do you suppose it signifies?" Clara didn't answer. Not immediately. Instead, she looked at Mrs. Wickliffe and saw, not control, not composure, but something else. Fear. "It signifies," Clara said slowly, "that something was removed, and this was left in its place." Mrs. Dalrymple shook her head. "That is pure speculation." Miss Marple spoke gently. "My dear Mrs. Dalrymple, the speculation is often the beginning of understanding. One must simply be careful where it leads." Mr. Bellamy's expression had not changed, but Clara saw the same flicker. He looked at the paper, then away, and in that moment, Clara understood something she had not fully seen before. "It is not what is missing," she said. Miss Marple nodded slightly. "It is who needed it to be missing." The room fell still. Mrs. Wickliffe rose. "I think," she said, "that we have indulged in this conversation quite enough." Her voice was steady again, controlled, but the effort, it was unmistakable. Mr. Bellamy stood. "Yes," he said, "quite enough." Clara watched him, closely, and saw, for the first time, that he was not merely explaining things, he was managing them. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "My dear," she said softly, it is always interesting when a pattern refuses to finish." Clara looked at her. "Why?" she asked. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "Because," she said, "it means someone did not wish the ending to be known." Clara's gaze returned to the paper, the missing lines, the deliberate absence, and she realized this was not a mistake, not an accident, not even a concealment. It was a message, and whoever had left it had expected someone to understand. That evening, as Clara walked away from the house, she felt the pattern begin to form, not complete, not yet, but visible, and at its centre, not the attic, not the courtyard, but something else, something that had been hidden long before everything was moved. Miss Marple walked beside her. "You see it now," she said. Clara nodded. "I think," she said slowly, "that the person who made this pattern was trying to say something." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "and I think they were afraid of who might read it." Chapter 11, The Thing That Could Not Be Spoken. Clara did not sleep well. Not from fear, she would not have admitted to that, but from a kind of quiet insistence in her thoughts that refused to settle. The pattern lay on her bedside table, folded with the same care Miss Marple had shown, and though she did not open it again, she felt its presence as one feels a letter not yet read. Something had been left, not by accident, not in haste, but with intention. And intention, Clara had begun to understand, was the most revealing thing of all. She arrived the next afternoon to find the house quieter than before, not empty, not still, but restrained, as though something had already occurred, and the room was waiting to see whether it would be acknowledged. Mrs. Dalrymple greeted her with a brightness that seemed carefully assembled. "My dear Miss Henshaw, how good of you to come! I had wondered whether yesterday's enthusiasm might have discouraged you." Clara removed her gloves. "I do not discourage easily." "No," said Mrs. Pembroke from her chair. "You do not?" The remark was not unkind, but it was not neutral. Mrs. Wickliffe sat by the window, knitting, counting, but Clara saw at once the rhythm had broken entirely. The numbers no longer followed one another. They started, stopped, restarted, as though the act itself had become an effort. Miss Marple sat beside Clara. "You have brought it," she said quietly. Clara nodded. "The pattern?" "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And you have not finished reading it?" Clara hesitated. "No." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Very wise. One should never rush to the end of something that was not meant to be completed." The conversation began slowly, cautiously, as though each word required consideration before being allowed into the room. It was Mrs. Pembroke who spoke first. "I think," she said, "that we have reached a point where silence is no longer useful." Mrs. Dalrymple gave a small, strained laugh. "My dear Maud, silence is very often the most useful thing available to us." "Not when it conceals more than it protects," Mrs. Pembroke replied. Mrs. Wickliffe set down her knitting. The sound of the needles touching the table was soft, but final. "There is nothing to conceal," she said. Clara looked at her, and knew that this was the moment. She reached into her bag, drew out the folded paper and placed it on the table. No one spoke. Miss Marple watched. Clara unfolded the page, carefully, deliberately. "This was left in the attic," she said. Mrs. Dalrymple frowned. "Yes, we are aware of that. "It is a pattern." Clara shook her head. "No," she said. "It is not." She turned the page, not to the front, but to the back. There, faint, almost invisible, were marks, not part of the pattern, not instructions, numbers, written lightly, as though added later. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Ah," she said softly. Mrs. Pembroke stood. "What is it?" Clara traced the marks with her finger. "They are not rows," she said. "They are not stitches." She looked up. "They are dates." The room held that. Mr. Bellamy spoke. "They could be anything," he said. Clara met his gaze. "No," she said. "They could not." She pointed. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her finger moved. "Each line, each section, corresponds to a date." Mrs. Dalrymple shook her head. "This is absurd. Why would anyone hide dates in a knitting pattern?" Miss Marple answered. "Because," she said gently, "it is the last place anyone would think to look." Clara continued. "They are not random," she said. "They follow a sequence." She paused. "And they stop." Mrs. Pembroke leaned closer. "Stop?" Clara nodded. "They stop on the same day the attic was cleared." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Mrs. Wickliffe did not move. Mr. Bellamy spoke again. "This proves nothing," he said. Clara turned to him. "It proves," she said, "that something was being recorded." Miss Marple added softly, "and that it was not meant to be seen until it was." Mrs. Dalrymple looked between them. "I do not understand. What was being recorded?" Clara did not answer. She looked at Mrs. Wickliffe and saw, not fear, not now, something else. Resignation. "You do," Mrs. Wickliffe said quietly. Clara held her gaze. "Yes," she said. The room shifted. Miss Marple spoke. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a woman who kept a record of every letter she sent. Not the contents, only the dates. It seemed quite pointless at the time, until, of course, one realized that the letters themselves had disappeared." Mrs. Pembroke frowned. "And what did the dates prove?" Miss Marple's voice was very soft. "That something had existed," she said, "which someone wished to deny." Clara felt it settle. The pattern, the missing lines, the hidden dates, not instructions, a record of something that had been removed. Mr. Bellamy stepped forward. "This is speculation," he said, but his voice was no longer steady. Clara saw it and knew. "It is not speculation," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "No," she said, "it is an observation." Mrs. Wickliffe stood. For a moment she seemed smaller, not diminished, but I was relieved. "I could not keep it," she said. The words were quiet, but clear. Mrs. Dalrymple stared. "Keep what?" Mrs. Wickliffe closed her eyes briefly. "The records," she said. Mr. Bellamy spoke sharply. "Eleanor," she did not look at him. "They were never meant to be found," she continued. Miss Marple watched her. "But they were not destroyed," she said. Mrs. Wickliffe opened her eyes. "No," she said. Clara felt the final piece shift into place. "You moved them," she said. Mrs. Wickliffe nodded. "Yes." Clara's voice was steady. "And someone else knew." Mrs. Wickliffe did not answer. She did not need to. Miss Marple spoke quietly. "My dear," she said, "it is always a mistake to believe that one is the only person who understands the importance of a secret." Clara turned and looked, not at Mrs. Wickliffe, but Mr. Bellamy, and saw, at last, the truth waiting to be spoken. Chapter 12. The truth that could not be kept. No one spoke at first, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had begun to surface could no longer be arranged back into something harmless. The room held its shape, the chairs still aligned, the baskets still placed with careful symmetry, but the meaning beneath that order had shifted beyond recall. Clara remained standing. The paper lay open on the table before her, its incomplete pattern now irrelevant beside the faint penciled dates that had turned it into something else entirely, a quiet ledger of what had once existed and no longer did. Mrs. Wickliffe did not sit down again. She stood near the window, as though she required the light not for comfort but for clarity, her hands loosely clasped before her, no longer occupied with the steadying rhythm of knitting. Mr. Bellamy, by contrast, had not moved at all. He remained exactly where he had stood when Clara first turned toward him, one hand resting lightly against the back of a chair. It was the sort of stillness that might once have appeared composed. Now, Clara thought, it looked like calculation. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "My dear Mrs. Wickliffe," she said, her voice gentle but carrying an unmistakable direction, "it might be easiest if we speak plainly, not for the sake of accusation. No one here has accused you of anything but for the sake of understanding. People are always more at ease with the truth, even when they do not like it." Mrs. Dalrymple gave a strained little laugh. "I am not sure I agree with that at all. I have known many truths that have been most disagreeable." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but one always knows where one stands with them." She turned her gaze not to Mrs. Wickliffe, but to Mr. Bellamy. "And one does not," she added, "when explanations are offered too readily." Mr. Bellamy inclined his head slightly. "You appear to suggest," he said evenly, "that I have been less than candid." Miss Marple smiled in a way that was neither unkind nor reassuring. "I suggest nothing," she said. "I merely observe. In St. Mary Mead there was a gentleman who prided himself on answering every question promptly. People admired him greatly for it. It gave them a sense of security. But one day it became clear that he had never once answered the question that had actually been asked. He answered the question that would keep matters comfortable." Mrs. Pembroke's voice cut in, sharper now. "And comfort, Mr. Bellamy, seems to have been the very thing you have been providing." Mr. Bellamy's expression did not change. "Ladies," he said, "this is becoming unnecessarily theatrical. Mrs. Wickliffe engaged me to ensure that certain minor disturbances did not escalate into gossip. I have done precisely that. There is no further matter." Clara felt something settle in her chest. No doubt. Certainty. She turned toward Mrs. Wickliffe. "You said you moved the records," she said quietly. "You did not destroy them." Mrs. Wickliffe's gaze flickered. "No. And you did so recently." "Yes." Clara drew a breath. "Because someone else knew they existed." Mr. Bellamy then moved. Only slightly. But it was enough. Miss Marple spoke. "It is always the timing that matters," she said softly. "Not the existence of a secret that can persist for years quite comfortably, but the moment at which it becomes inconvenient." She folded her hands. "My dear Mr. Bellamy, you have been Mrs. Wickliffe's solicitor for a long time, have you not?" "Many years," he replied, "and in that time you have had access to her affairs, her documents, her history. That is the nature of my profession." "Quite so," said Miss Marple, "and one develops, I think, a certain familiarity. One knows what exists, and perhaps more importantly, what must not be allowed to be examined too closely." Mrs. Dalrymple looked bewildered. "I do not understand what any of this has to do with disturbances in a knitting parlour." Miss Marple turned to her kindly. "My dear Mrs. Dalrymple, disturbances are rarely about the things that appear to be disturbed. They are about something else entirely." She glanced at the paper. "The pattern, for instance. It was never meant to be finished. It was meant to be read. That tells us that Mrs. Wickliffe wished to leave something behind, something that could be understood if the right person looked at it carefully." Mrs. Pembroke leaned forward. "A record," she said. "Of what?" Mrs. Wickliffe answered. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the room with unmistakable clarity. "Of what I had done." No one interrupted her. "For years," she continued, "I adjusted accounts. Small amounts at first. Nothing that would attract notice. It was always temporary, always to be corrected. But temporary things have a way of becoming permanent when no one looks too closely." She paused. "I did not take anything for myself," she added, almost sharply. "I moved funds, rearranged them, made use of what was available. It was manageable." Mr. Bellamy spoke then, his tone carefully controlled. "Eleanor, there is no need." She turned to him. "There is every need." Clara watched him and saw it clearly now. Not surprising, not concerned, but something else. Recognition. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "You were not the only person who knew," she said. "It was not a question." Mrs. Wickliffe did not look away from Mr. Bellamy. "No," she said. Mrs. Pembroke drew in a breath. "Then why? Why move the records now?" Clara answered before Mrs. Wickliffe could. "Because he told her to." The words landed with quiet finality. Mr. Bellamy turned to Clara. "You presume a great deal, Miss Henshaw." Clara met his gaze. "No," she said. "I observe." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Quite right," she said. "It is always better to observe than to presume." She turned to Mr. Bellamy. "You knew about the records," she said gently. "You advised Mrs. Wickliffe on them. Perhaps even assisted in keeping matters orderly." Mr. Bellamy's silence was answer enough. "And then," Miss Marple continued, "something changed. You became aware that the records themselves might be examined, that they could no longer remain safely where they were." She paused. "And so you suggested they be moved." Mrs. Dalrymple shook her head. "But that does not explain the disturbances," Miss Marple finished for her. "No, that is the more interesting part." She looked at Mr. Bellamy. "My dear sir, you provided a very reasonable explanation for those, did you not? Drafts, latches, old building settling. It was almost convincing." Mr. Bellamy said nothing. Miss Marple's voice softened. It always is when one wishes people to stop looking. Clara felt it then. The final piece. "You used the disturbances," she said slowly, "to create confusion, to make it seem as though nothing deliberate was happening." She took a step forward. "And when the records were moved, or you knew where they had gone?" Mrs. Wickliffe closed her eyes briefly. "I told him," she said. Mr. Bellamy's hand tightened on the back of the chair. Miss Marple spoke very quietly. "And you went to retrieve them." The room held its breath. Mrs. Pembroke whispered, "And—" Miss Marple did not look away from Mr. Bellamy. "And something happened," she said. Clara saw it, in his face, in the smallest shift of expression. "Not intended," she said. Mr. Bellamy's voice came low and controlled. You have no proof? Miss Marple inclined her head. No, she said. Proof is such a difficult thing. One so rarely has it at the right moment. She paused. But one does have people, and people, well, they tend to reveal themselves when they are under strain. Clara looked at Mrs. Wickliffe and understood. You went to stop him, she said. Mrs. Wickliffe opened her eyes. Yes. Her voice did not tremble. He said it was necessary, she continued, that the records would ruin everything, that they must be removed entirely. I told him I would not allow it. She swallowed. We argued. Mrs. Dalrymple's voice was barely audible. And then? Mrs. Wickliffe looked at Mr. Bellamy. He pushed me, she said. The words fell, soft, final. Clara felt the room shift. Not violently, but irrevocably. Miss Marple spoke. And you fell? Mrs. Wickliffe nodded. I struck my head, she said. I do not remember much after that. Only when I came to, the records were gone. Silence. Mr. Bellamy straightened. That is an unfortunate misunderstanding, he said. Mrs. Wickliffe was distressed. She lost her footing. I assisted her. There was no... Miss Marple interrupted gently. My dear sir, it is always possible to describe an action in such a way that it appears accidental. She looked at him steadily. But people rarely believe those descriptions when the person offering them has already arranged so many other things. Clara felt it settle. The truth, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Mrs. Pembroke spoke. You took them, she said. Mr. Bellamy did not answer. He did not need to. Miss Marple folded her hands. My dear, she said quietly, it is a very dangerous thing to believe that one can remove a problem simply by removing the evidence of it. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to conceal. Chapter 13. The Last Stitch. Clara did not at first notice when the room began to quiet itself. It was not sudden. No one rose in alarm, no voice was raised, no gesture demanded attention. And yet, as though guided by some unspoken agreement, everything settled into stillness, not the careful, arranged stillness Mrs. Wickliffe had cultivated, but something more natural, something that followed truth rather than attempting to shape it. Mr. Bellamy stood where he had been, though the quality of his stillness had altered. It was no longer composed, it was held. Mrs. Wickliffe had taken her seat again, not by the window this time, at the table. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, empty. For the first time since Clara had known her, there was no knitting, no counting, no effort to impose rhythm upon the moment. Mrs. Dalrymple sat very straight, as though posture might protect her from understanding. My dear Eleanor, she said, her voice thinner than Clara had ever heard it, this has all become very distressing. Surely we can find some way to put it right. Mrs. Pembroke did not look at her. One does not put things right, she said quietly. One sees them as they are. Miss Marple rose, not with urgency, but with the calm deliberation of someone who has reached the end of an observation rather than the beginning of an action. My dear Mr. Bellamy, she said gently, I think you will find that there is very little left to manage. He gave a small, tight smile. You assume a great deal, Miss Marple. No, she replied. I have simply watched. She moved a little closer. It is always the same, you see. One believes that if a thing is arranged carefully enough, it will hold. But people are not patterns. They do not remain where they are placed. They shift. They change. And sometimes, she paused, her voice softening, they reveal more than they intended. Mr. Bellamy looked at her steadily. And what, precisely, do you imagine has been revealed? Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she glanced toward the door. The maid stood there, silent, but present. Clara had not seen her arrive. You have been very quiet, Miss Marple said kindly, and very observant, I think. The girl flushed slightly. I only do my work, miss. Yes, said Miss Marple, and you do it very well. You move about the house without drawing attention. One might almost forget you are there. The maid hesitated. Then, I was there, she said. The room shifted. Mrs. Dalrymple turned. Where? In the courtyard, the girl replied, her voice gaining steadiness as she spoke. Yesterday morning, before anyone came. Clara felt her breath catch. I saw Mr. Bellamy, the maid continued. He had something in his hands. Papers. He was at the shed. Mr. Bellamy's expression hardened. This is ridiculous. The girl is mistaken. The maid shook her head. No, sir, I am not mistaken. I saw you burn them. Silence. Not empty, not uncertain, complete. Mrs. Wickliffe closed her eyes, not in shock, not in surprise, but in recognition. Mrs. Pembroke spoke. You destroyed them, she said. Mr. Bellamy didn't answer. He did not deny it. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. My dear sir, it is always unfortunate when one forgets that other people may be present, even when one has grown accustomed to acting as though they are not. Clara looked at him, and saw, no calculation now, not control, but something smaller, something that had no place left to go. Mrs. Dalrymple rose suddenly. This cannot be true, she said. It simply cannot. Thomas, you must explain yourself. You have always... She stopped, because there was nothing he could say, that would restore what had been. Mrs. Wickliffe opened her eyes. "They are gone," she said. The words were quiet, but final. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "They are." She paused. "But that does not mean they never existed." Clara felt something settle. Not triumph, not relief, understanding. Mrs. Wickliffe looked down at her hands. "I thought," she said slowly, "that if I could keep it contained, if I could manage it carefully enough, it would not matter, that it would remain separate." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said. "People often think that." Mrs. Wickliffe gave a faint, almost weary smile. "But it does not remain separate," she said. "No," Miss Marple replied. "It rarely does." The room held that truth, not dramatically, but completely. Mr. Bellamy moved at last. He picked up his hat. His movements were precise, controlled. "I think," he said, "that I have been subjected to enough interpretation for one afternoon." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course," she said. He turned toward the door, and stopped, because the maid had not moved, because the room had not allowed him to leave unchanged. Clara did not see what passed then, not clearly, only that something in him shifted, and then he went. No one followed, no one spoke. After a time, Mrs. Dalrymple sat down again, slowly, as though the act required thought. Mrs. Pembroke reached for her knitting, then stopped. "There seems little point," she said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I think there is always a point," she said. "It is simply not always the one we expect." Clara looked at the table, at the folded pattern, at the place where the missing lines would have been. "It was never meant to be finished," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "No," she said. "It was meant to be understood." Mrs. Wickliffe lifted her head. "And now it is," she said. There was no bitterness in her voice, no resistance, only acceptance. The light in the room had softened, not dimmed, but changed. Clara rose. She did not know why, only that it felt right. Miss Marple joined her. At the door, Clara paused. She looked back. The chairs remained, the yarn, the careful arrangement, but something had altered. Not the room, the meaning of it. Outside, the evening air felt clearer, lighter. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "You have done very well," she said. Clara shook her head. "I only noticed things." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is how it is done." They walked a few steps in silence. Clara spoke. "What will happen now?" Miss Marple considered. "My dear, that depends on many things, on what is said, on what is admitted, on what people are prepared to live with." Clara nodded slowly. "And Mrs. Wickliffe?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "She will have to decide," she said, "whether she wishes to continue counting, or to stop." Clara thought of the steady rhythm, the careful control, the effort behind it, and of the moment when it had broken. They reached the gate. Clara looked back once more. The house stood as it always had, neat, orderly, composed, and yet she knew that something within it had finally come undone. Miss Marple spoke softly. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a woman who spent years mending things. Clothes, curtains, small household repairs. She was very good at it. Nothing was ever allowed to remain torn or frayed. But one day, quite unexpectedly, she stopped." Clara glanced at her. "Why?" Miss Marple smiled. "Because," she said, "she realised that some things are not meant to be mended." They stood for a moment, then turned and walked away. Not from the house, but from the pattern that no longer needed to be finished.